Everything you always wanted to know about the wine and sparkling wine industry, including champagne. Let's start by the world vineyard surface. If there are vineyards almost everywhere in the world, they are mainly situated around the 40th parallel north and south. They occupy, in fact, a very small surface, only 7.5 million hectares, which means that to produce all of the world's wine, we only use the equivalent of 3% of the world's surface of wheat. Our culture is one of wine and bread. However, compared with wheat, vineyards have a rather discreet presence, and often on land which would have no value if viticulture did not exist. In France alone, field crops take up more than 12 million hectares. The national grain production equals 9.1 million hectares. 7.5 million is the amount of hectares used by the national grain production if we were to exclude corn. But let's get back to the vineyards. Analyzed by country, the top 5 consists of Spain, France, Italy, China, and Turkey, who together make up 50% of the world's vineyard surface. Let's remember that as a whole, almost 50% of the world's vineyard surface are concentrated in the European Union. And within Europe, 3 countries take up more than 1/3 of the world's total vineyard surface: Spain, France, and Italy. Wine growing is essentially a Mediterranean culture. Europe dominates the wine growing surface area. In Europe, France, with almost 800,000 hectares, takes up 1/4 of the European wine growing area and 10% of the total vineyard area. A closer look at the wine industry. There is a downward trend, mainly because the decreased wine production in Europe has not been compensated by the increase in vineyard area elsewhere, mainly in Asia and America. Italy and Spain, minus 17%. France and Turkey, minus 13% and minus 12%. China, plus 127%. India and New Zealand are the countries who have increased their vineyards area the most, plus 180%. To come back to our wine region, let's remember that in comparison with the rest of the world, champagne surfaces are minute. Certainly, they make up 4% of the French vineyard area, but only 1% of the European vineyard area, and only 0.4% of the total vineyard area in the world. After wine growing, wine production. The world's wine production is 271 million hectoliters. The champagne production less than 1,000 of this volume. This last decade has seen a very modest increase in volume. The wine production is dominated by Europe. 80% of the world's wine is produced by 10 countries. Among them, France is the largest wine producer in the world and is responsible for 1 out of 6 liters. After the production, wine consumption. The worldwide wine consumption has increased slightly, 243 hectoliters in 2013. Historically, Europe led the wine consumption. However, things have changed. Between 2000 and 2013, the European Union lost 8 points of market share, mainly to America, plus 3%, and Asia, plus 4%. Consumption decreased in Europe, the traditional production and consumption area. It collapsed in France, to such extent that now the USA takes pole position of the world wine consumption by volume. After consumption, the wine trade. We can see that the volume of wine sold increased by 63%. In value, the increase is even more striking, 86%. The average litre price has increased by 35 euro cents. Who sells these 100 million hectoliters of wine worth 26 billion euros? In volume, the 3 leaders are Italy, Spain, and France. In value, 2 countries take the lead, France and Italy. However, when we review the price by litre in euro, France outperforms Italy, 5.35 euro compared to 2.46 euro. And when we look at the price of champagne per litre rather than bottle, we can see it stands out. And so what about sparkling wine? The sparkling wine production growth can easily make others envious. It is bubbly, 40% in 10 years' time. Furthermore, sparkling wine now makes up 7% of the world production compared to 4% in 2000. Who is behind this production? 4 European countries, France, Italy, Spain, and Germany, are responsible for 2/3 of the world's sparkling wine production. A quick word about the sparkling wine sales. We notice with satisfaction that if the wine trade is dynamic, the sparkling wine trade is even more dynamic. The bubbles progress even quicker. However, this satisfying sales volume is almost nothing compared to the value. The wine trade value progresses fast. However, the sparkling wine trade is even faster. To resume, we should remember that on a world scale, sparkling wine makes up 9% of the total wine volume, but 18% of their value. That is twice as much. And when we look at champagne, it may only be 1% of the world wine volume, but it is responsible for 9% of their value. 9 times as much. Champagne is indeed a unique product. This can be proven when we focus a bit more on other sparkling wines, often cited and sometimes feared, whilst in fact we really cannot or should not compare ourselves with them. For instance, looking at Italy's Prosecco, Spain's Cava, or Germany's Charmat-produced sparkling wine, it is clear that Champagne does not want to compete with any of these models. Whether we compare the vineyard area, which often lacks the constraints imposed by an AOC, or the grape price. Prosecco grapes are paid between 65 cents and 1.2 euros a kilo. Cava grapes even less at 40 euro cents, and German tank-fermented sect is often made from imported still white wine of less than 30 euro cents per litre. Let's remember what was reported by the newspaper Enjeux Les Echos last March. Rotkäppchen is the only one German company to sell 170 million bottles per year. Up to 49,000 bottles per hour are produced in its brand new factory, 5 days out of 7, 24 hours a day, with a team of 15 people. Bottles are sold at $3.99, except in times of promotion when it is $2.99. This is half the price of 1 kilogram of our grapes. Champagne cannot or should not want to play on those fields. If we were to do this, our loss is guaranteed. Our assets are very different to theirs. We are destined for excellence. It's the only way to set us apart, to remain sought after but never equaled. And as the only way to be followed is to head up the race, Champagne needs to run faster than the others. After this little world tour, let's return to Champagne for a few important reminders. For vines are perennial, not relocatable plants. They are a French asset, often underrated and not enough promoted. Who knows that the national wine industry is the leading agricultural sector, before grain, milk or meat. It employs 500,000 people. The wine industry covers only 3% of the usable agricultural surfaces, but it generates 15% of the agricultural value. Whereas Champagne is 4% of the French wine industry, 1,000th of the usable agricultural land, but 6% of the agricultural production, and adding 2.4 billion euros to our exports. Champagne is little but important. We can even assert that Champagne makes up only 0.4% of the world's vineyards, but 12% of the wine consumption value. Champagne is little but very important. Let's point out as well that with 0.4% of the world's vineyards, Champagne is furthermore responsible for 40% of the sparkling wine value. Factor 100. Champagne is little but very, very important. To highlight this, let's remind ourselves, with the help of some simple indicators, that Champagne pushes way above its weight. For example, 1 hectare of Champagne vines means, in production, 10,000 bottles. In employment, 1 full-time employee. In taxation, 21,000 euros of taxes before personal tax. In trade balance, 70,000 euros. In image, 30 tourists. To conclude, let's claim that France's wine industry is the top world wine producer with 46 million hectolitres of the 217 hectolitres produced in 2014, and the top wine exporter in the world by value, worth 7 billion euros. France is the top sparkling wine producer with 410 million bottles produced in 2013, and the top sparkling wine exporter in value, worth 2.45 billion euros. Champagne is responsible for 90% of this value. France is also the top consumer of still and sparkling wine, in bottles consumed by person. To top this off, the French meal, including its wines, has been recognized as an intangible cultural human legacy protected by UNESCO since November 2010. Wine has been included as part of cultural, gastronomic and protected landscape heritage of France since October 2014. The hillsides, houses and cellars of Champagne, representing the Champagne region, have joined Saint-Emilion and Burgundy, the only other French wine regions, on the World Heritage List of UNESCO. But Champagne, as well as the whole of the French wine industry, are still submitted to the loi vin and the censorship of the ANPAA. If, in the 17th century, Molière's Tartuffe demanded breasts would be covered so we would not be able to see them, we are now pushed by the loi vin and the ANPAA to hide our wines so it will not be drunk. This information will also be partly available, among other facts and figures, in the pocket magazine published by the Syndicat Général des Vignerons de la Champagne.